Hey, welcome to Gold Scratch. So if you're a Pontiac guy and you've been watching my videos, you'll know the name Joe Fernandes. Joe is famous for something that he's not very happy about, no fault of his own. And we made a video about this last fall when he brought this engine to me. It was a 455 Pontiac engine in a 68 Firebird. It was running fine, and Joe had it idling while he was sweeping out his shop. And this little guy found its way from the top of the carburetor, somehow got past the butterfly throttle plates, got into the engine. And when we took it apart, there's a video on the details. I've actually taken it apart live. This was sitting in piston just like that. This is the top of the piston. It broke the piston, but worse than that, it even broke the block. So this 455 block is cracked. So that was back in probably September, October. And Joe's been busy. He likes to do things right. So in that period of time, basically we're going to build Joe a brand new engine. This is the old core. We're going to use all the accessories, water pump and oil pan and that stuff from this engine. And we'll go over here now and show you what we're going to do next. So we're going by Merrick's engine. We're still going to do it, but we're waiting for a camshaft. So we don't have that yet. So Joe's got everything ready to assemble. It's going to be this is the work that I love to do. All the parts are clean and ready to assemble. We just do the measuring and assembling. So Merrick will be back to you when we get Merrick's parts, and we're going to do it next. But we kind of reversed the order because basically availability of parts. So this is like Christmas Day, guys, for Pontiac guys. This is everything that we need to build essentially a brand new engine. So Joe bought another 400 block, so it's going to be a 400 this time. And he's been waiting on a machine shop really since September, October. Mainly, that's been the main issue. Local machine shop did all the work. They do good work as well. And so the blocks all prepped and bored, honed, ready to assembly. Cam bearings are put in it. So I love it because all that work's done for me and I just have to assemble it. So there's the block. So let's go in order of importance, I guess. The crankshaft has been turned. This is another crankshaft that Joe picked up, and it's obviously a Pontiac 3-inch crankshaft. It's been turned 10 thou, and it's ready to go. Joe also bought brand new Eagle connecting rods with ARP rod bolts. So life doesn't get much better than that if you're a Pontiac guy. These are the same forged piston. He bought these forged pistons from Mike. They're L2262s, sealed power, I think, pistons. These are forged pistons. I haven't done any measuring. That's the first thing we're going to do. We haven't started anything. Joe just brought the parts yesterday. So obviously, measuring every connector rod clearance, main bearing clearance, cylinder bore is number one step before we start assembling. So cylinder heads, Joe's got number 16 cylinder heads. One's still in the bag. The other one's here, totally assembled for me, so I don't have to do anything. One of the things we will do to validate is measure combustion chamber volume, deck height, and piston dome and all that stuff, and determine its static compression ratio, dynamic compression ratio, and what compression pressure we're going to see when we finally get this engine together. So that's coming. Cylinder heads are ready to go for me. I got to put accessories on them, of course. One thing we don't have is rocker arm studs, and we got those coming. So intake manifold, this is an Elderbrook manifold. Joe cleaned it up and painted it. It looks beautiful. And pretty much a knockoff of the stock one, except probably 30 pounds lighter or more than that. Brand new valley pan from Butler, okay, which is important. Everybody wants to know about the camshaft. So Joe picked the Summit 2802 camshaft. And if you're a Pontiac guy, you'll probably already know that number by heart. And that's the camshaft we're going to use. So what goes over the camshaft? Johnson high lift valve lifters, which is the preferred piece. So we got good lifters, good camshaft for them, vane bearings, rod bearings, new piston seal power piston rings, nice brand new roller rocker arms, and locks as well. So that's going to be nice to assemble. One piece oil pan gasket. The only thing I ever use anymore is a one piece oil pan gasket. They're definitely the way to go for any build. He also has a standard gasket set under here, new head gaskets in this box. So these are the 39 thou standard Felpros. So once again, I've got to do the calculation and see what our compression is going to be. BOP oil seal, the same as the one that I already installed in Merrick's short block. And just remember, please like and subscribe. Give me a like, and somebody else might like it too. And that'd be really nice to help my channel grow. Thank you. Joe also has the paint. And if you're a Pontiac guy, you probably know this. There's different colors of this stuff, even if it's Pontiac paint. So this is the correct restoration paint for his engine. Now he's already painted it, painted the block. We've got a little bit of touch up maybe to do on assembly. But the oil, maybe the oil pan, I got to take the oil pan and pump off the other engine. He even bought me spark plugs. So we've got everything we need to build a nice 400 Pontiac engine, and we will make videos about it as we go forward. One of the things people have shown interest in it, and of course Merrick's engine was going to be exactly the same process. We're going to try and show degreeing the camshaft. I've been asked to do that. I have other videos about degreeing camshafts, but you're not going to go back and find it, so we'll do it on this Pontiac for you, and provide as much detail of the assembly as we can as we go forward. Okay, we thought we'd show as much detail, thanks to Alex's suggestion, show as much detail of this assembly and getting ready for assembly as we can on this Pontiac build of Joe Fernandes. And if you ever built an engine, you probably already know getting ready to do almost everything takes more time than actually doing it. So preparing the parts for assembly, measuring them up, all that kind of stuff takes time. So one thing we do, even though this crankshaft has been reground, flushed, magged, hot tanked, all that kind of stuff, we take our Moroso brush like this and put it in every port and make sure it comes through on the other side and is nice and clean, just in case there's any obstruction that gets in that port somehow. So everybody that's watching probably knows the main bearings feed the rod bearings. So I'm coming from the rod to the main, but we've already kind of done this and flushed it out with brake clean after and blown it out as well. But just to make sure all those ports are good. And then the next thing, we're going to put the camshaft in first to make sure it fits, because it's a new Summit 2802 cam. I'm not sure if I mentioned that in the previous clip of the video. It's a Summit 2802 Pontiac cam. So one of the things we do is the cam bearings were installed by the machine shop. So these holes in the block, in the saddles, the oil pressure comes. I've showed the oiling in Pontiacs before. There's a diagram of it in a previous video. But the oil comes down the main here. It comes out at this port here to feed the main bearing, and then the rod bearing, or the camshaft bearing, gets fed from there. So there's two holes in each of the centers, and in the front, it just doesn't just feed the cam bearing; it goes to feed the other bank of the cylinders as well, the other mains as well. So, or the lifter valleys, I mean, sorry. So one of the things we do, if you squirt a little oil, this was one where you can see in the hole and it comes out in the cam bearing, then you know for sure that the cam bearing's installed properly and lined up properly. You can see the oil coming out bottom there, and I got to oil the cam bearings anyway because they're going to put the camshaft in next. So that's what we're going to show that in a minute. Okay, the previous clip we showed making sure that there's oil getting from the feeds from the main bearings down to the cam bearings. We squirt a little bit of oil in there and you can see it coming in. It also lubricates the bearings, put it in. This is the Summit 2802 cam that Joe bought. So let me give you the numbers on it first. It's the intakes at the cam is 311, 325, and that gives us, we're at 466, 488 total lift, intake and exhaust. And the duration is 298, 303, advertised duration, 224, 234 at 50 duration. And this cam is, we're going to put this in at 190 degree lobe center. And so 2802, if you're a Pontiac guy, you're probably familiar with that. So when you go to put your cam in, you've heard my speech before, make sure you read all the instructions, right? Even if you've done it before, there might be something different. So inside the cam box will be the instructions, the cam specs, which you always need to know, and the cam lube was with this one as well, right from Summit. So I've already put it on the cam lobes and on the distributor drive gear. On the bearings, you don't put it on the bearings, you just put ordinary oil on the bearings. I've already lubed up the camshaft bearings. The camshaft is part way in already, so let's see if we can get it the rest of the way in. And once this cam is in, it's going to stay in. We're not taking it back out. So just go nice and slow. You may have to turn it as you go. Sometimes I just use the cam gear, give me a little leverage. One of the nice things about doing it before you, there's no pin on there. To go. Before you put the crank gear in, is you can reach down and help yourself, like I'm doing right now, and lift it up. And we are in. No key on it, so I can't turn it. I got to put a key on the gear first. The cam is in. It fit in pretty nice, so that's one more step. We'll get back to you with the next steps. I was just putting the camshaft in before, and I used the crank gear just to get leverage to guide the cam in. It's in fine. I've coated all the lobes with the cam lube that come with it. It's a Summit 2802 cam. I already talked about the specs. One thing you want to make sure, the cam went in nicely. You always want to fit a cam. Sometimes when the bearings go in, they're tight. But because there's no keyway, I don't have a keyway in here yet right now. So just to show you with a socket, the camshaft turns over nice and smooth. No problem with that at all. And there's nothing to retain it yet because we haven't got it. We haven't got all the other parts on it. But the camshaft is in, and the camshaft is going to stay in. So since you made the last clip, we've measured the piston bores, all the piston bores with a micrometer, check the clearance with the dial bore gauge, and we'll show a dial bore gauge exercise when we do the crankshaft live, but someone asked for that. I have done that a few times before, but we'll show it again. Installing the main bearings. So these are Clevite 77s as well. And these ones that Joe bought are the full groove Clevite 77s. They're 10 under. So putting them in is fairly simple in the case of these ones, because typically if there's only a half groove, obviously the groove goes in the block side because that's where the oil comes from. And the solid part of the bearing goes in the other side. But in this case, they're the same, top and bottom. It actually says on them. Should always check if you're putting a bearing in. We know the crank's 10 thou under. On the back of the bearing, it'll tell you the bearing number and whether it's ground under 10, 20, 30, whatever. So the number's there, the date's there, 10 thou under size. It's a good thing to check that all the time. Now, when you do your measuring, if you measure everything, you're going to find out if it's wrong. But it's just a good idea to check it. It doesn't take much time. And what's the best thing to do to a bearing before you put it in a new block that's nice and clean? Nothing, just put it in. You don't have to, other than make sure that it's clean. You don't have to do any machine work on it. It's ready to install. And so we use the tang to line it up. And it just sits in there, whoops, just like that. That's pretty much all there is to it. we'll put the other half in the top halves. Then we'll drop the crankshaft in, and we'll start measuring crankshaft diameters, bearing diameters, and see how much bearing clearance we have as well. Okay, since the last clip, I'm trying to show you guys, girls, much as we can. So we got the bearings all put in, and we're working on the first three center journals first. By the way, as we go, we mark everything down with a pen. These are numbers from the piston clearances. And then I transfer that to an Excel spreadsheet later when I'm in the house or whatever. And we'll do the same thing now. We date everything, of course. Do the same thing now for the bearings, starting with the main bearings. So what we've done so far, installed the main bearings and torqued them down. Pontiac, by the way. The main bearing bolts are 1/2-inch bolts, and they're torqued to 100 foot-pounds, 1, 2, 3, 4. And number 5 is actually 120 foot-pounds. So they're nice and sturdy main bearings anyways, with that big of bolts. Chevrolet is only 7/16 and 80 foot-pounds, I think it is. So anyway, they're torqued down. So we got to stop now, but what we'll do, we'll measure every journal on the crank, starting with the center journal with a micrometer. Put the micrometer in the vise. Zero the micrometer on the dial bore gauge, and then check for the actual clearance in the main bearing. We'll do that on the next clip. So that's where we're at. Thanks for watching, and we're going to put as much detail as this Pontiac as we can. But we thought we'd make a little clip about the unique things about a Pontiac, because they definitely are. So if you go back to the muscle car era in the 60s, the GM philosophy was they had divisions of GM, Chevrolet, Pontiac, Buick, Oldsmobile, and Cadillac were the main divisions, and I guess the truck division. And the philosophy of GM was they all competed with each other, with a passion. They didn't even like each other, for what it's worth. And when you look at the difference between a Pontiac and a Chevrolet engine, small block or big block, doesn't matter. They obviously didn't talk to each other, and GM didn't oversee or override a lot of things they did. And DeLorean is the guy associated with being the first muscle car in 1964. And at the end of this clip, I'm going to tell you how that came about, what the definition of a muscle car is. And so we're going to come back to that. So the Pontiac, if you're used to working on small block Chevrolets, you got to get retrained when you do a Pontiac, because they're definitely different. So let's start with some of the differences on the top, and then we're going to stop, flip it over, and show you the differences on the underneath. So the first thing is the firing order is the cylinder numbering is the same on the driver's side, 1, 3, 5, 7. The passenger side, 2, 4, 6, 8. However, on the Pontiac, number 1 cylinder is not the front cylinder in the engine. Number 2 is. And so if you go to the crankshaft journal, the number 2 cylinder crank rod connects to the front of the journal. And whereas on Chevrolet and I think most other engines, number 1 cylinder is the front cylinder on the block. So that's a unique thing. One of the other things is the distributor goes on the passenger side rather than the driver's side of the block. And why is that important? It's important because it makes the distributor shaft turn counterclockwise when the engine is turning clockwise, which is pretty unique. And if you didn't know that and you went to time a Pontiac, you get pretty messed up, because you're trying to adjust it, it goes the wrong way. So that's important to know. Also on a Pontiac, the camshaft's retained by a retaining plate, which also oils the timing gear. And this little eccentric guy here is actually what runs the fuel pump. So the whole housing bolts onto the front of it. Don't have that in this video. And the lever for the fuel pump is actually not bolted to the block. It's bolted to the timing cover housing, okay, which is different as well. One of the other things, and I'm bringing this up because someone asked this question in a video, or in my comments of a previous video, a Pontiac only has 10 cylinder head bolts. So it only has 4 cylinder head bolts for each cylinder, whereas a Chevrolet has 5. And a Chevrolet, it turns out to be, they have 17 per side, and a Pontiac only has 10. But here's the difference. A Pontiac have half-inch bolts, which are torqued to 95 foot-pounds, and a Chevrolet has 7/16 bolts, which are torqued to 65 foot-pounds. So that the clamping force of the Pontiac, I haven't calculated, it's probably actually higher, because don't forget the strength is the square of the diameter of the bolt. So probably higher. The issue is the block has to be stiff enough and the cylinder head has to be stiff enough to hold it down. And obviously it is. That's not a big problem with Pontiacs. Don't have an issue with, usually anyway, head gasket failures. And so that's some of the unique things about a Pontiac. And we're going to stop here and flip the motor over and continue on the other side. Okay, we're back showing you the unique stuff about a Pontiac. And the punchline is going to be the first muscle car that I brought up in the first half of this clip. So upside down, what's different about a Pontiac as well? One thing I showed in, we'll show another video when before the camshaft is in. Once again, we decide to move this clip to the front. Pontiac actually has priority main oiling. What does that mean? It means that the oil pressure goes to the main bearing first and then goes to the cam bearing. In a Chevrolet, all block Chevrolet, for example, it's the other way around. The camshaft actually sees the oiling before the crankshaft does. So priority main oiling. The other thing is the main bearing saddles for a Pontiac use half-inch bolts to hold them down, whereas a Chevrolet uses 7/16 bolts. So the torque on a Pontiac these are 100 foot-pounds each, and the rear main actually has the 9/16 bolts, which is 120 foot-pounds. So should be a pretty darn rigid bottom end. The thrust bearing for a Pontiac is on number 4 journal, whereas the thrust bearing for a Chevrolet is typically on number 5 journal. So that's a little bit different as well. So what else can we tell you about it? So on the Pontiac, the numbering of the main bearing caps is very visible. Sometimes on a Chevrolet, it's hard to discern that. But the orientation is not shown. So on a Chevrolet, there's a little arrow at the front of on every main bearing cap showing you which way it goes to the front of the engine. On the Pontiac, they don't have that. However, you don't really need it because the tang, location of the tang is in the block. And as long as when you put the cap on, the tang lines up with the tang, and the other side of the bearing that doesn't have a tang lines up with that side, you got it right. So you never have to worry about that. Always just try to think about it logically. You can always figure it out. So I mentioned at the beginning, DeLorean, who led Pontiac division in the 60s, he didn't design this engine. The original engine was actually designed in the 50s. And Alec and I were just talking about, we think we're pretty smart because we know how to modify them. How'd you like to design this thing from scratch? Knowing you have to make a casting, you have to make a mold, you have to make a pattern, and you have to take care of all these little holes that feed the oiling to your valve lifters and crankshaft and all that kind of stuff. So, as I mentioned, 1964 was the official start of a muscle car era, and that's debated a little bit because there was a lot of hot cars before that. There was a dual quad 409s and the 427 Fords, but all those engines were in full-size cars. So the definition of muscle car is when Pontiac decided to put the engine out of a full-size car, which is a 389, which was designed for a Bonneville, or the full-size cars like that, and put it in a Pontiac Tempest. So basically they took a full-size car engine, 389, might call it big block. Now the other thing I guess to note, all Pontiac block architecture is the same, right from 1954, the 326, the centering distance of the piston bores. There's no big block, small block in a Pontiac. There's one block, And a 326 and a 455 look exactly the same on the outside. And that's unique as well. Anyway, in 1964, Lorian basically went against the GM philosophy and put a big block engine in a Tempest, and that was called the GTO, 1964. And for many people anyway, that's considered the beginning of the muscle car era. And so what happened after that? They started putting 427s and 396s in Chevelles and Camaros and Novas, and that's the definition of a muscle car. They had a philosophy in GM that you couldn't have more than 400 cubic inches in a Camaro size chassis. I forget the name of the chassis. And so how did they get around that? They built the 396, and a lot of the dealers, like Berger Chevrolet, for example, bought brand new Camaros with 396s in them, took them out, took the 427 engine that belonged in a Corvette and put it in the Camaro and sold them, and sold off the 396s to somebody else. That's how they got around that. GM would not sell more than 400 cubic inches in the compact cars. So that's how they did that. So I hope you found that interesting. And this clip is going to be followed by, we're showing you details of checking main bearing clearances, piston to cylinder wall clearances, all the things we need to do to assemble this Pontiac engine for Joe Fernandes. We're going to do check the clearance on number one journal of the crankshaft for you. But I thought before we did that, I always talk about using the dial bore gauge. So I thought we'd show you kind of how they work. So obviously you got a variety of dimensions to use, right down from a crankshaft that small block Chevrolet could be down to 2 inches, and right up to a cylinder bore or bigger, 5 or 6 inches. So that's accomplished using this variety of little plungers that you can change out that come out of the here, and you basically, if you want longer lengths, this goes on top like that, and then this part goes on top of that. So you can use this dial bore gauge for a variety of lengths. If it's in between and you haven't got it covered, they've got these little wee guys, which I use my little calipers or whatever to catch. And it's kind of a trial and error unless you learn which one's which. And so basically how it works is there's a little plunger in the bottom of the gauge. So as I push down, you can see if you watch the gauge, I push down on the plunger. Okay, that makes the gauge move. So you just get that set into the space that you want. And we start by zeroing it on the micrometer that I take the dimension of the crankshaft and then put it into the space, and we'll see what clearance is. These gauges are not that expensive, under $100 or around that. And this is probably a Chinese gauge. Now, a thousandth of an inch in China is the same as a thousandth of an inch in North America, so it really doesn't matter. And the beauty of a dial bore gauge is, compared to measuring the diameter of the journal and the diameter of the bearing, diameter of the bearing, and then adding and subtracting, you got a lot of dimensions, a lot of measuring to do, and then you got some math to do, and there's an easy chance to make a mistake, and it takes longer. The dial bore gauge, you're only measuring one thing, and that's the clearance. It doesn't even matter what the dimension, I've mentioned this before, of the crankshaft is. All that matters is how much space. The oil doesn't care about any of that. It just cares about how much space there is between the bearing and the journal. And so we're going to show you doing that. So we start off by putting the dial bore gauge down, measuring the crankshaft journal. And now it's going to try and come in here and do that. So we just got to get a feel where we're just touching it. You don't want to be forcing. If you have to force it at all, then you got the wrong number. So we got that setting. So this crankshaft is 10 thousandths undersized, so it's a 3-inch crankshaft. So if it was right on the number, it would be 2.090. So it's actually that if the 15 was added up, it would be exactly 2.090. It's not quite. It's whatever line lines up on the vernier scale with this scale is the number that you have. So that looks like 2 is lined up best. So it's 2.902 is actually the dimension of the crankshaft. That's interesting information, but it's not necessary. So the important part is we put it in the vise, take our dial bore gauge. I'm going to have to turn my back to you, Alec, in order to do that. I can't work from this side. Sorry about that. I did that before. So we put the dial bore gauge into the space, and if you could see the gauge itself, we go till it's got a 0. So it stops out at 0. Showed you how it worked. Okay, there it is, close enough. Okay, and now we know that's 0, and we put it into the. I'll come around this way, Alex. Sorry, this way you don't have to. Here you go. We're just trying to manipulate our. Put that into the space, and we measure what it says. And what does it say? 2.002.4 thou. Maybe 2.3 thou. 4. 4 is good. Almost 2.5 thou, which is good. So we do that obviously with every bearing. I've already done everyone except the back bearing. I think I forgot to mention also, maybe I did on the previous clip, the thrust on the Pontiac is at number 4 journal, number 4 main bearing location, whereas the thrust on a small box Chev is number 5. I think I did mention that. So that's how you do a clearance, and that same procedure is used whether you're doing a rod bearing, main bearing, cylinder bore, or anything else where you want to determine clearance. In the previous clip, we checked the bearing clearance in this number 1 bearing with a dial bore gauge. That's the preferred way. However, not everybody has a dial bore gauge. So one of the conventional ways of doing this, and the way I did it years ago, my first rebuilds, were with plastigauge. It's a common term. So what the heck is it and how does it work? So how plastigauge works is, Alex is going to have to come in here a little closer. So there's a little thin strip that's basically come kind of a wax, okay? So if I was going to do this, I would cut off about that much of the wax, and I would sit it right in the bearing like that. I have to put the crankshaft in and torque it to spec, and the less the clearance is, the thicker that little piece of wax is going to get, right? So then when you take the bearing, the crankshaft back out, there's a little gauge right on the plastic gauge, and then you have to look really closely. Is this the thou? Yeah, there you go. Hang on. There you go. So if it stayed as thick as the big green line, you'd have 1 thou. The next line is 1.5 thou. Next line is 2 thou. The next line is 3 thou. So obviously, the more clearance you have, the less the plastic gauge is going to squash. And it's actually very accurate if you're careful on how you do it. But obviously, it takes a lot longer because you got to put it together, clamp it down, take it apart, do it again for every rod and every journal. So that takes time. And then you got to scrape. The plastic gauge usually sticks to the bearing, and you got to scrape it off. It takes time, but this is very, very inexpensive. And if you haven't got a dial bore gauge and a micrometer and you got to get one engine done, there's nothing wrong with using it. Thousands of engines have been built with plastic gauge, and it worked out just fine. The next step in Joe's build is to get the crankshaft into the engine, and we'll measure the cranky rod journals and all that stuff when the crankshaft's already in. So one of the sort of tricky parts is installing the BOP seal. Now these originally engines came with a rope seal, and lots of guys use them successfully. But this is also a pretty popular solution to a rope seal. One of the things, there's a lot less friction with these than a rope seal provides. So they're not inexpensive, but they are a good solution. So when you take the BOP seal out of the package. These little squares go to the back of the engine and this part, so the lip of the seal faces the front engine. Same idea as a seal on a small block or big block Chevy. The lip of the seal has to face the front of the engine. And we have to fill this gap with grease and before we put it in for permanently. But we're going to put it in for a trial first and make sure that it fits good and clamps down and all that. So the other part of the installation is we put a light bead of Permatex Ultra Gray, which is good for oil sealing, in this space, and we fill these two holes here. The intention originally was when the rope seal squished into these two spaces, that prevented the rope seal from rotating or turning. So we have to fill those spaces up before we do that, and then put a little bit of sealant here and grease on the inside. We've already put some assembly lube on the bottom of the bearings. We've already checked these bearing clearances in another video. So that's the next step. So the seal comes with, there's a little hole, one place in one of these dots, and that's the only place you can cut it. So I probably have to put it on the bench. Maybe not. I can do it here. There we go. It's cut. So it goes on the crankshaft. Little squares go to the back, and the leading edge of the seal where it's got the little herringbone markings go to the front, and it goes on just like a slinky goes on. Basically, squeeze around like that. Comes back together, and when it goes into the block, we always want this gap to be located in the top of the block, not in the bottom. Okay, and it'll squish back together. The hex on the crankshaft is to provide oil for the rope seal, and it's not going to be a problem. It's always there on these crankshafts. It's pretty standard, unless it's an aftermarket crankshaft. And so next step is we're going to locate the seal, put the crankshaft in, and locate it dry. Before we do that, make sure it all fits together good. The seal at the parting lines is not squished. Take it back out, and then we'll fill it with grease, like I said, reinstall it, and put it back in the engine. We're back making progress, and we just had a discussion about this. We spend as much time making videos as we do building engines, but that's okay. If this is helpful for anybody that's viewing this, then it was worthwhile. So in the previous video, we prepared the BOP oil seal, and we cut it, we fit it over the crankshaft like a slinky. We put a match mark 180 degrees away from it to make sure that we got the parting line of it in the top side of the block. It doesn't have to be in the very middle, but it's in the top side of the block, probably an inch or more. And one of the other things we did off camera, and we set it in place. We use a little bit of Permatex, the OD in the groove where the original oil seal went. We put the top on dry, make sure it's aligned. It squishes nice into place, and the grooves where you want it. Take it back off, and then we have to put Permatex in the top side as well. So hopefully I showed enough about the BOP oil seal. We talked about Pontiacs, so this is about the only time I get to use this torque wrench. Usually I use my smaller one, which is up to 100 foot-pounds. The rear main bearings on the Pontiac are 120, and all the other ones are 100. I've already done the rear main because when we put the BOP oil seal on it, we wanted to torque it down and make sure everything was good there. And now we're torquing down the main bearings. And the next thing we'll do, each time we torque a bearing, we'll try to spin it over and make sure there's no change in resistance. The only resistance right now is created by the seal mainly, and the fact that we put assembly lube in all the bearings. Assembly lube is pretty sticky stuff, and if you just use a lightweight oil instead of it, the crank will spin a lot nicer. But when you're spinning it, what you're really looking for is a tight spot. If it's the same all around, okay, and we do this progressively as we The next step is going to be measuring all the connecting rod bearings and start putting pistons in. As we put them in, we turn it every time to make sure there's no tight spots. And typically for an engine like this, the biggest resistance is the piston rings, the drag on the piston rings. If they're new piston rings, we'll have something between probably 30 and 35 foot-pounds of torque. We actually put a torque wrench on here when we get it together and measure the torque, 30 to 35 foot-pounds, just to turn the assembly over with all the pistons and the piston rings on. As the piston rings get worn in, they'll get a little better, but the main drag is you got a new crosshatch on your bore, you got new piston rings. They got to get to know each other. And over time they will, and that friction will go down. One of the reasons why when you start a new engine up, it generates a lot more heat than an engine that's broken in. We measure header temperatures and block temperatures, how long it takes for the engine to heat to normal temperature. And it's always faster when the engine is new. And as we get things broken in, that gets better. So we're going to torque this guy down, and each time, and once again, the only time I get to use this big wrench, now the main bearing cap bearings are 100 foot-pounds, 1 to 4, and number 5 is 120. I've already torqued it down. So we go to 100 foot-pounds and torque it. So, and I think I mentioned in another clip, pretty sturdy bottom end. Small block Chev only has 7/16 main bearing cap bolts, so 1/2 inch is a lot more. Still turns nicely. Oops. Go back to number 4. Turn it again. No tight spots. That's what we're looking for. And what we do in the process, I'm torquing it now. Before the oil pan goes on, we retorque all the rod bearings and main bearings and write it down at 10 after 1 on February the 18th or whatever today is. We torqued all the bearings, so we don't have to worry about whether we forgot something. So that's the process. Document. I had a case in my younger years where I woke up in the morning and I couldn't remember doing that, so I took the oil pan back off, and sure enough, they were torqued. But you got to have that peace of mind, sort of a sleep at night process. And turning nice. So the main bearing clearances we showed checking one, they all come in between 2.5 thousandths and 3 thousandths, and that's fine for main bearings. Nice job on the machining. Every journal was plus or minus 1/10 of a thou. So all those numbers worked out good. In the next process, next clip, we're going to check the thrust bearing, the thrust clearance in the block. We got to do a setup for that. We'll show you that, and then we'll do the rod bearings. So the next step is making sure that you got sufficient thrust clearance. So number 4 main bearing on a Pontiac is the thrust bearing. On a Chevrolet, it's number 5. It's in number 5 bearing, the back main bearing. So number 4 main bearing is where the thrust clearance is. So what's it for? It's to make sure, just to hold the engine, the crank from wanting to go one way or the other in the block. And in a normal situation, when the engine's running, it shouldn't see a lot of force on it. If you have a standard transmission car and you have a clutch, you're pushing on it when you push the clutch down. And that creates a little bit of stress. In some race cars, because they don't use a conventional setup behind the block, they've had problems because they're putting force on that bearing all the time. You don't want to be doing that. So one of the things to do once, we showed torquing the main bearing caps in place in the previous clip. You take a big rubber hammer and you hammer on the front of the snout and you hammer it back. And the idea of that is just to make sure the thrust bearing halves are properly aligned in the block. So I've already done that. I don't think anybody wanted to see that. So we're going to show the thrust clearance. So we've got a gauge on it right now. So if we go, it's actually in the open, there's 0, okay? And they go the other way, there's about 6/7 inch. That's fine. It just needs a little room in there for oil to get in there. It's not force fed. It just needs a little room for oil to get in there. And actually is fed from the main part of the bearing as well. But it just needs a small clearance. Obviously, you don't want your crankshaft moving back and forth very much. So next step, we're going to measure all the connecting rod bearing clearances. And once you get that figured out, we can start putting pistons in. Welcome back to our Pontiac build. So since the last clip, I think we torqued all the main bearings. The crankshaft is in. We already checked the torque, the turn for the crankshaft. It's nice and smooth. There's no binds. That's an important thing. So the next thing is the connecting rods, measuring the connecting rod bearing clearance. So I described the process using a dial bore gauge in the previous video, so we're not going to repeat that. But a couple things to note. One of them is, if you're doing anything like this, make sure you got the right information. So I call this my Bible for the shop here. I got everything I need to know in this for every engine I've ever worked on, including 6 cylinders and Austin Healey's, whatever. But my Pontiac page here has all the torques, all the clearances and stuff, factory numbers that I need to know. I refer to that often. But when you're using a part that's not an aftermarket part, like these beautiful Eagle connecting rods, they have ARP rod bolts in them. So you can't use the Pontiac spec anymore. So you make sure you got the spec from ARP. But I make a point here. So ARP with 7/16 bolt heads, which it has. It's a beautiful product, but the torque's 40 foot-pounds. And that torque's no different than, I think, the torque on the Pontiac's 43 foot-pounds. So the clamping force that's created between your bearing cap and your rod is proportional to how much torque you have in it. So an ARP bolt doesn't clamp your rod any tighter, because it can't. If you ever tightened an ARP rod bolt to its yield point or its limit, you'd probably distort the connecting rod. So they're a great product, and if you buy an aftermarket rod like this, like these Eagle rods, they're going to come with it, and they work great. But if you don't have that, and you got stock rods and stock rod bolts, millions of cars running around with them, they're just fine. So this is also a connecting rod, probably obvious to everybody. This is called an H-beam rod, because if you cut a cross section in this rod, the flat side rods, it would make an H, and the other kind of rod is like a stock rod would be an I-beam rod. If you cut a section across it, you would get an I. So a couple other points. We did the piston clearances yesterday using the same process. So this was done by a machine shop. These are forged pistons I mentioned already, Steel Power L2262. And they're between 2.5 and 3 thou. I was kind of worried because typically forged pistons are a little more than that, 3 to 4 thou at least. GM, wherever they use forged pistons, like in Z28 engines or the L88 engines, they were 3 to 4 thou. So a little bit looser than that. And so I did some homework and the spec. And for an L2262, actually the minimum clearance that they specify is 1.5 thou. Now, if it was 1.5 thou, I'd be pretty worried about it. But 2.5 to 3 thou, we're good to go. We're going to put it in the way it is. So the pistons are cleaned up. Alex put the rod bearing inserts in already. We'll do the measurement exactly the same way that we did the connecting or the main bearings in the crankshaft. Fit them, and the next thing we have to check the ring end gaps. When we do that, we'll show a video of that. We'll leave the rings right in the bores that we check, and so they're all ready for assembly. And we'll go from there. So make sure you use the right specs. You have the information. Don't guess. Don't have regrets after that you didn't check it out. Do it right the first time. Last point, and we're going to close off this video. And we started with the introduction of it and all the steps we've taken. And so Mike's got a big job editing. There's multiple clips of procedures that we've done. So I missed one thing I want to talk about, and then we're going to close this video off, and we'll make other videos as we progress. What's left to do? The connecting rod bearing clearances have not been taken yet. Once we take that, the connecting rods are ready to install. So then we got to go on the other side. We've already measured the piston bore. We know that. We know we got the right clearance. I just talked about that. We're going to measure the ring end gaps, leave the rings in the hole they belong in the order that they come out. Install the rings on the pistons and start putting pistons in. That would be the subject of another video. So I wanted to cover off one more thing. These connector rods, these beautiful legal connector rods, come with ARP bolts, and the specification provides two things. One is the torque. I already mentioned that. It's 40 foot-pounds, which is I think stock one's 43, I think. So that's not an issue, but it also measures bolt stretch. So the bolt stretch that it specifies is 0.0045 to 0050. So 4.5 to 5 thousandths of an inch. Now, most people don't have a proper equipment to measure stretch. In this case, you'd have to have a micrometer there's actually stretch micrometers with little points that zero in right on the center line of the rod, and as you torque it, you measure that stretch. However, if you use the ARP rod bolts and you use the ARP lube that's supposed to go on it, and you torque it to the spec that it says, the 40 foot-pounds, and you measure the stretch, guess what? It's going to be between 4.5 and 5 thousandths. That's just the way it's designed. I've done checks on that before. I've torqued it to spec, measured the stretch, and the numbers come out. So don't worry if you don't have a stretch gauge. It's a nice tool, but if you got good clean threads, quality bolts, and you're lubing them properly, and you're torquing it properly, and you go use the torque spec, you'll be just fine. Remember that the torque spec stretch is designed, and I've made videos about fasteners before. The stress in the bolt is about 75% of its ultimate. In other words, for elastic range, where the bolt doesn't stretch anyway, it stretches, but it won't come back to where it started when you take the stretch off. So 75% is a safe number. If it's 80 or 70, your bolt's still going to be nice and tight. So don't get all excited about that. Torque it to spec, follow the procedures, whether it's OEM or ARP, and you'll be okay. You do not need to go buy a stretch gauge to put together a typical engine. Good thing to do, makes you feel good, and it is a confirmation that you got it right. And it is the ultimate measure, but the way it's designed, if you follow the procedures, you'll be okay. Thanks for watching this clip. Thank you for watching Gold's Garage channel. We've tried our best in this process of Joe's Pontiac to provide as much detail as we can. I hope you find it helpful. Look forward to your comments and questions. I'm sure there'll be some more. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Send it to a friend. Help us to continue to grow, and we'll keep making good videos. Thanks for watching.